Hi, hello. We're not even in October yet, but there have already been so many good horror films this year. So I wanted to take some time today to share my optimism for this genre, especially since I thought 2023 was a bit of a letdown. I try to keep up with most horror releases, and last year there were only about 6 films that I really loved. And to be clear, those films were Infinity Pool, Thanksgiving, Cobweb, The Passenger, Sick of Myself, and Influencer. Other than those films, it was hard to narrow down a top 10 last year because there just wasn't a lot of stuff I felt super passionate about. There was lots of things I thought were good or okay, but getting to that top 10 was a little bit difficult. I'm looking to rework my format for whatever year in review video I do for this year, but for now, let's just do a little pre-spooky season check-in. What I have figured out while doing this channel is that I need to care about the movies I talk about. When you watch as many horror movies as I do, I think it's very easy to burn out, and that's the worst thing that can happen to me when I watch a film and I just feel indifferent about it. I feel like there's been cases where I've really tried to force myself to say something interesting about a film, and it just doesn't work for me. But then at the end of the summer, I started to catch up on a lot of the horror movies from this year, and we're so back. There's been lots of great horror movies in cinemas this year. Longlegs, Immaculate, Maxine, and I Saw the TV Glow are all films I enjoyed greatly, and most of them seem to have done pretty well at the box office. The only outlier here is I Saw the TV Glow, which only had a limited theatrical release in the US, but it's important to note that box office revenue isn't as important with modestly budgeted films. There's rentals, rights to streaming, and physical media sales as well. Because of this, even the artsier horror films are pretty much surefire bets for movie studios because they just aren't spending a lot of money on these movies to get them made. There is clearly a market for quote-unquote elevated horror, and I don't think that's going to slow down anytime soon. Longlegs' production budget was under $10 million, and it made $101 million at the box office worldwide. It is the biggest financial success so far for its distributor Neon, who also had a big hit with Immaculate earlier this year. Regardless of what you think about those two specific films, this is great for the genre. It's a trend we've been seeing for a while, so bigger studios are already taking notice and putting more care into their franchise films like The First Omen or Alien Romulus. Hell, even Blumhouse just released a critically acclaimed remake of a foreign film with Speak No Evil. It turns out the winning strategy to a healthy movie industry is just by making good films and marketing them well. Who would have thought? But what I think stands out to me the most about this year is how much fun we're having, collectively as horror fans. There have been so many movies this year that feel like they are celebrating the history of horror. We've had 2 non-exploitation films about the potential birth of the Antichrist, and they both did really well. We had Maxine, which concluded the greatest horror trilogy of all time while simultaneously making lots of fun callbacks to older horror films. It seems like we are finally at a place where most of the people making these movies in Hollywood are actually fans themselves. This wasn't always the case, and Maxine actually has a lot of fun with that. They acknowledge in that film that most of the people making horror in the 80s were using it as a stepping stone to break into the industry. In a Violent Nature is another film that owes a lot to 80s horror, Friday the 13th in particular. I mean, it's basically Friday the 13th from Jason's perspective, and I found it oddly calming. It's kind of like watching slasher ASMR or something. I get that everyone is not going to be into that, but art house Friday the 13th is such a fun original idea that I really loved the film. I think everyone's a little tired of 80s nostalgia at this point, but both Maxine and In a Violent Nature worked for me because they're also bringing something new to the table. Right now, it's easier than ever to go back and watch some of these older films that are referenced in contemporary horror. The killer in Maxine, for example, looks exactly like the one in Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, and you can just watch that film on Shudder. I think this is great for people who are only now getting into the genre. There's a lot to discover, and for me, that urge to hunt down weird old movies never really went away. It's wonderful to not have to look for overpriced DVD or Blu-ray copies or illegal download links. Tubi has so many old horror movies on it as well, and you can just get on that shit for free. Speaking of free movies, micro-budget filmmakers are posting their stuff straight to YouTube now. This year we've had 2 notable found footage films released this way, Milk and Cereal and Life of Belle. I did not really care for either of these films, but I know a lot of my other fellow found footage freaks out there did, so that's why I'm including them here. Nevertheless, I think releasing the movies for free on YouTube is a really cool way to get some traction. I always wonder how that stuff works out financially, but I also must admit that the movies being free is what made me go watch them. So obviously the marketing worked as intended. Milk and Cereal currently has over 700,000 views, and it was uploaded just a month ago. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that horror, on all scales, seems to be thriving right now. I know it's been that way for a while, but last year I was actually worried that we were going to see a downturn, but I'm glad those anxieties have been squashed. It seems like we just needed some distance and time from the pandemic because shooting films during COVID was a nightmare to deal with. And I guess to sum up this part of the video, I'm mostly happy that horror movies are fun again. I love the dark, serious, brooding stuff like The Babadook or Hereditary, and that wave of films has done a lot for the genre. But I also appreciate a little bit of camp every now and then. I grew up on slasher movies, so films like Maxine are really heartwarming to me. It was even more heartwarming that Maxine actually did quite well at the box office. There's an appetite for all types of horror right now, and I think that's awesome. I also put down in my notes that I should talk about horror-adjacent films. I was trying to come up with a catchier name for these films, but it's basically non-horror movies that I think appeals to a horror audience. We've gotten a lot of these recently, and that's definitely contributed to my overall positive feelings about this year as a whole. Rebel Ridge, which comes from the director of Green Room, is a new thriller that recently dropped on Netflix, and it's a must-watch. It's an action thriller, very much inspired by First Blood, but I feel like that only tells half the story. It's very intense and sometimes infuriating because you're going to despise some of these characters. It has a wonderful leading performance from Aaron Pierre, who only has a couple of credits so far, but he is going to be everywhere in the next couple of years. Red Rooms is finally in limited release in the US as of the time I'm recording this. Us Europeans got it earlier in the year, and it's a courtroom drama slash techno thriller that's also one of the scariest films of the year. There are sequences here that literally had me on the edge of my seat. I do not want to say more about the plot. It's very psychological, with a main character that's pretty disturbed in some uncomfortable ways. It feels very current. It has a lot to say about the state of the world, true crime, and how isolated we are as a people due to technological advancements. I really, really recommend seeing Red Room. I'm even happy we're getting films like M. Night Shyamalan's Trap. Do not get me wrong here, this is certainly not a perfect film, but it has a lot of big ideas, and I always appreciate that. The first half of this film is both Hitchcockian thriller and concert film, and it's fucking crazy that it works as well as it does. This is certainly not one of Shyamalan's best films, but I'm really glad I watched it. It has some goofy moments, especially towards the end, but it felt very fresh and original to me, and I think that's mostly what I'm looking for these days. I've basically stopped watching films that I think look very generic to me, and that was a very healthy decision. I do not need to sit through more mediocre films about haunted houses or demonic possessions. I'd much rather watch something like Trap that tries to do something new. Or, if you're going to follow a very familiar formula, do what Frogman did with found footage and just take the piss out of it for a little bit. I think this is another reason why these horror-adjacent films speak to me, because mixing up different genres in creative ways is always going to be super interesting to me. Then you have films like Civil War and Love Lies Bleeding, which, again, aren't horror films, but they come from people who have worked within the genre and understand it well. I was especially taken by the brutality of Civil War, and it deeply affected me. I want more war films from genre directors because they tend to do it really well. War is hell, so you need someone who can accurately portray that. I also think there's a lot to say about the response to Civil War, but that's very much a topic for another day. I've mostly talked about bigger films of the year so far. Regular viewers of my channel will know that that's not usually what I focus on. So before we wrap up today, let me share some of my favorite indie and straight-to-streaming releases of the year. These aren't in any particular order, and I'm gonna blow by them pretty quick. I'm suspecting that I will have a lot more to say about these films at the end of the year. Trim Season was sold to me as a killer weed movie, but that makes it sound so much worse than it actually is. It's about a group of strangers who get roped into trimming weed for a criminal organization in the middle of nowhere. It's a film that juggles a lot of different elements of horror, so it takes a while before you see what's going on. I don't want to ruin it for you, there's a lot of surprises along the way. So what I'll say is that I think they do a good job of grounding this story through some really great characters. This is one of those concepts that could have been really goofy, but I promise you it's no evil bong. This is actually a really well done film. Another one I don't want to say too much about is What You Wish For. It's about a chef who travels to South America to meet an old friend who he met in culinary school. So they both work within the same profession, but his friend is vastly more successful than him, at least financially. Over the course of the film, you realize that there is a reason why his friend is able to have such a luxurious lifestyle, and it causes a lot of problems for the both of them. Because the main character is a chef, the film immediately drew comparisons to The Menu, but it actually has a lot more in common with films like Uncut Gems or Trapped that I mentioned earlier. There's also a bit of Shiva Baby in here because it's so comedically hectic at times. There's a lot of dark humor in this film, so if that's your thing, I highly recommend checking it out. There's more films that I've talked about previously on this channel that I really like Monolith, New Life, All You Need Is Death, Blackout, Loop Track, and Faceless After Dark. And so if you haven't seen any of those, I definitely recommend checking them out. They're also pretty different from one another, so I'm sure you'll find something you'll like here. If you're feeling strong-stomached, I can also recommend The Coffee Table, a movie with a humor so dark that it left a lot of people calling it the most disturbing film of the year. I am not one of those people. I was able to see the humor in it, but it's definitely a wild watch. The Coffee Table is a Spanish-speaking film, and if you've noticed, I haven't really talked a lot about non-English-speaking films yet. Just The Coffee Table and Red Rooms. This is actually one of the reasons why I'm so positive that 2024 will be remembered as a great year for horror. It usually takes some time for international films to be discovered. Sleep is a Korean film that I've heard a lot of people talk about all year, and it's finally now being released on VOD at the end of September. I'm sure there are a ton of other lesser-known non-English speaking films from this year that's going to find an audience once they are readily available. There's also still a lot of films I need to catch up on. Blink Twice and Cuckoo are dropping on VOD in just a couple of days, and I've heard great things about Oddity, which is the new film from the director of Caveat. I really like that film, and it sounds like Oddity is even better. We're also, as I said at the top, not even in October yet, so there's a lot to look forward to, and I've just been covering movies today. If you know any good horror TV shows, video games, or books from this year that you want to recommend, please drop them in the comments. I hope you were able to get something out of this video, and if you did, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. I've been working on a lot of very fun and exciting stuff behind the scenes, and those videos will hopefully begin to drop shortly. I'm also figuring out what I'm doing at the end of the year still, because I want to do something a little more special than just me sitting down and ranking all of the films. We'll see what happens. Please stay tuned, and thanks for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. Okay, bye.